Ken Whiting with Paddle TV, and in this video, we're looking at some game-changing tips for inflatable kayaking. These tips are for people who may be looking at buying their first inflatable kayak or for active inflatable kayakers. And so let's dive right into it. The first tip has to do with this, the paddle. And the tip is quite simply, not any paddle will really do the trick for inflatable kayaking. You need to have a paddle that's the appropriate length for the kayak that you're using. So what's the appropriate length? Well, as a general rule, the wider a kayak is, the longer a paddle you're going to need. And the reason for that is very simple. As a kayak gets wider, after you take a stroke on one side, if the paddle isn't long enough, if it's too short, you'll have to reach over and take a stroke on the other side. And this motion back and forth across the boat is very inefficient. But the other thing that happens is as you cross over, all the water on that blade will run down and drop right onto your lap. And so you'll just be getting wet all day long. Now, on the flip side, if your paddle is too long, and it helps to have an adjustable paddle like this, then when you're taking a forward stroke, your blade will be entering the water so far out to the side from your kayak that it'll effectively be turning you a lot with every stroke you take, instead of propelling you forward. And so you need to have a paddle that's the right length so that you're getting maximum forward propulsion while at the same time not having to cross over your kayak quite so much. So what is the right length? Well, paddles are measured, no matter where you are, they're measured in centimeters. And they range for flat water kayaking from 210 to 260 centimeters. Now, the wider your kayak is, the longer the paddle you'll need, and inflatable kayaks are typically quite wide because they prioritize stability. And on top of that, instead of a thin piece of plastic, you have tubes on the side that make the kayaks wider. So you can expect to need a paddle between 230 to 260 centimeters. Now, the other two factors that impact length a little is how big you are. Taller paddlers will want a slightly longer paddle, and how high you're sitting in the kayak. Some inflatable kayaks have raised seats, and when you're sitting higher off the water, you have to reach further down to get to the water, and so you'll need a slightly longer paddle. And so aim for a paddle somewhere between 230 to 260 centimeters, depending on how wide the kayak is and how big you are and how high you're sitting. Now, the problem with a lot of cheap kayaks is they come with basic paddles, but for some reason they make these paddles way too short. They're usually in that 210, maybe 220 centimeter length, but people really should have a 240 centimeter or more paddle. And so get yourself a paddle of the appropriate length. Moving right along to the second tip, game-changing tip for inflatable kayaking, and that is to get yourself an electric pump. And this really only applies for those who are going to be kayaking more than a couple of times every year. If you're going to only paddle a couple of times every year, you don't need an electric pump, just hand pump the kayak. But if you're going to be doing it more than that, hand pumping a kayak gets old pretty quick. Not only does it make you sweaty on the hot days, but it's a bit backbreaking, especially for bigger inflatable kayaks. And so an electric pump really makes a difference. Not only is it faster and easier, but the other cool thing about electric pumps is that it helps you deflate the kayak as well. When you're done paddling and it's time to fold the kayak up, pack back in its bag and head out, well, almost all electric pumps can be put from inflate mode to deflate mode, and that sucks the air out really quick, so you don't have to try to squeeze the air out. Makes it much easier to fold the kayak down nice and small, get it back in its bag, which can sometimes be a challenge, and get back to what you were doing quicker. Now, the third game-changing tip for inflatable kayaking, well, Before we get into it, first I need to give a quick thanks to the sponsor of this video, who is very appropriately Sea Eagle Inflatable Kayaks and their newly updated 393 Razorlight kayak, which weighs in at around 35 pounds or 16 kilos. Now, if you're not familiar with this boat, I gave it a Paddle TV award a few years ago for being one of the best inflatable kayaks on the market, and it's still deserving of that award. There are a few things that make it special. For one, it's a fully drop-stitched inflatable kayak, which I'll be talking about momentarily and the benefits of that. But it also has a capacity of 500 pounds or 227 kilos, which means it can easily handle a paddler and a ton of gear if you want to use it for kayak camping trips. But I think one of the best things about the 393 Razorlight is that it's one of the few inflatable kayaks that's truly designed to be fast and fun to paddle, and to paddle as well as a hard shell kayak. Most inflatable kayaks prioritize stability, and they gain stability at the cost of performance. The 393 says, you know what? We're gonna give up some stability. That's okay, because we want a boat that's faster and more fun to paddle. Now, the updates for 2025 include some new graphics, but more importantly, it now has tie-down loops in the front and back to secure gear. It now has a center carry handle to make it easier to move the boat around. And it has Sea Eagle's new Flex Brace 2 foot peg system, which are solid and simple to install. Even though the 393 is really fun to paddle, it's not the right boat for everybody. And so to determine if it is the right boat for you, check out my full review of the 393. I'll leave a link in the description box down below. I'll also leave some links to some of the other Sea Eagle kayaks, which may be a good fit for you instead. Now let's move right along and get right into it and talk about third tip, which is to get yourself a drop-stitched kayak if you can. Now, what is drop stitching? Drop stitching is the way some inflatable kayaks are built. And really what it means is inside the tube, you have threads that hold the tube together. Now, the benefit of that is that you can now pump that tube up much harder and it holds a great shape. We're talking about a non-drop stitch kayak, you pump up to around 2 PSI. Drop stitched, you pump up to around 10 PSI. It's much firmer and it's going to perform much better because of that, much more like a hard shell kayak. Now, similar to the electric pump, if you're only going to paddle a couple of times a year and you really just want to get on the water and it's not about covering any distance or having a really fun paddling time, then maybe you don't need a drop stitch kayak. But if you enjoy paddling and you want to improve the paddling experience, I would highly recommend upgrading to a drop stitch kayak. Now, the fourth tip for inflatable kayaking is don't let your inflatable kayak pop. And the way inflatable kayaks can pop, although it's not that common, is overheating, because hot air expands when it heats up. Now, this can be a problem if you pump up your kayak to its desired hardness, maybe in the morning when it's cooler. Maybe you do it in the shade, you do it in some cool environment, but then it's out in the hot sun and it gets warmer out, and that pressure inside the kayak just increases to the point where the kayak fails. Now, this typically isn't a problem when you're on the water because the water has a cooling effect on the air inside the kayak. Where it usually ends up being a problem is when you take a break from paddling. Maybe you're taking a quick snack break or lunch break or just a snooze on the shore. You pull your kayak up on shore, the sun beats down on it, warms it up, and the pressure builds to the point that, pow, a seam blows, it fails. It is a real possibility, and so you have to be careful when you take that boat off the water and leave it in the sun. What you want to do is leave it in a shady spot instead, or splash that boat with water on a regular basis. In some cases, you may even need to let some air out of the kayak to let some of the pressure off. Now, the next tip relates to another point of weakness or point of failure, potential failure with inflatable kayaks, and that's the air valves. And the tip here is protect your air valves. What does that mean? Well, problems happen when sand or dirt get into the air valves and they no longer seal correctly, then you can get a slow leak. And it can be a slow leak or it can be a fairly fast leak too. Either way, your boat isn't going to hold air. So how do you prevent that from happening? Well, the first way is to, hey, if you're in a sandy environment, try not to get any sand inside your kayak. Wash your feet off, wipe yourself off before you get into the kayak to minimize the amount of sand inside the kayak. The second thing is to use the covers for the valves. And every inflatable kayak will come with valve covers. Use them. Now, if a valve does fail, it's not the end of the world, although it's going to be a real pain in the butt on that particular day. But you can replace the valves, and it's not that tricky to do. Now, the next big tip, well, this one can be more than game-changing. This one can be life-changing, and it comes down to the question of, do I get a single or a tandem inflatable kayaks? You can get inflatable kayaks for 1, for 2 people, and some inflatable kayaks are even designed to handle 3 people, which is actually really nice for a small family with 1 child, or 2 children and 1 adult. Either way, what do you get? Well, this is a very personal question, but here's a couple things to consider. First of all, a tandem kayak is great with kids, an adult in the back and kids almost of any age, whatever you're comfortable with, in the front, because you have the most control in the back. Not to mention, when they're in front of you, you can see them and keep your eye on them. Tandem kayaks for couples can be a great thing or not. The benefit of tandem kayaks is that they're faster than single kayaks. On top of that, if somebody doesn't want to paddle, needs to take a break, well, the other person, in particular the person in the back, can continue to paddle and make progress while somebody's relaxing. Now, the flip side is that you're stuck with each other in a tandem kayak. And so you better have a good collaborative working relationship, because some people find it extremely frustrating to be in the same kayak, which is why tandem kayaks have often been called divorce boats. It's not for everybody. But if you can stay on the same wavelength, if you're both out there for the same reasons and not just one person to grind it out and get miles of paddling done and the other person just wants a nice day on the water, if you're out there for the same reasons and work well together, a tandem is a powerful machine. Now, if you're really not sure if a tandem or a single is the right boat for you, I would err on the tandem side. And the reason for that is most inflatable kayaks, the seats are movable in the kayak. And so you can use a tandem inflatable kayak as a single kayak. You simply move the seat towards the center of the kayak. Now, my final tip for inflatable kayaking is don't sweat too much about damaging your inflatable kayak. Yes, different inflatable kayaks have different levels of durability, and depending on your situation, that should be a consideration. Do you get a kayak that really focuses on durability, or can you get away with a cheaper kayak that may not be as durable? Either way, inflatable kayaks are relatively easy to repair in most cases. As I've already mentioned, one of the biggest issues is air valves starting to leak because you get junk, dirt and sand in them. You can order a replacement air valve and replace those fairly easily. The other issue that sometimes happens is a puncture in a kayak. Once again, not a complicated or difficult thing to fix. In fact, most inflatable kayaks come with a small repair kit with everything you need to make that repair. But I'm not going to get into how to do it because I did a video about that last year. I'm going to leave a link to that video down below so you can see how easy it is to repair a puncture in an inflatable kayak. So there you have it, my game-changing tips for inflatable kayaking. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, well, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to Paddle TV if you haven't already. Leave a comment down below if you have any tips to share with the other paddlers, other people looking at getting into inflatable kayaking or who've already started on that inflatable kayaking journey. And stay tuned because I got lots more paddling tips, gear reviews, and paddling adventures coming your way. In fact, I have an inflatable kayaking multi-day trip coming up next week that I'm very excited about. On a river not too far from here. It involves a bunch of flat water, a bunch of white water, a whole bunch of wilderness in the middle of nowhere. So stay tuned for that one on my new YouTube channel, Ken Whiting Adventures. And that's all I gotta say. We'll see you on the water.